Usually when we look at criminal statutes, there is this expectation of clean surgical precision, like an accountant's ledger.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Everything in its place.
Exactly. A sneaky pickpocket who slips a wallet out of your coat is categorized neatly over here, and a violent mugger who demands your wallet at knife point is categorized over there. And then a blackmailing extortionist who threatens to release your private emails, well, they're in a completely different book entirely.
It is binary, and honestly, it's comforting. I mean, we want the categories of bad human behavior to be entirely distinct with clearly defined boundaries. It just makes the world feel organized.
But when you actually try to map out how a simple property crime escalates into a violent felony in the real world, suddenly that clear ledger becomes incredibly murky. Things get messy fast. How exactly does the law differentiate between that sneaky pickpocket, the violent mugger, and the extortionist when a situation just spirals out of control?
Oh, it is the absolute definition of a diagnostic minefield for law students and practitioners alike. So today, we're going to trace that exact analytical journey. Our deep dive will dissect the 8 specific elements of robbery, treating it fundamentally as an aggravated larceny.
Okay, wow. 8 elements.
Yeah, it's a lot. And we'll deeply analyze the highly nuanced requirements of taking from a person or presence and having that specific intent to steal. We will also examine the absolutely critical doctrine of concurrence, which trips up so many people. And finally, we will contrast robbery with statutory extortion.
And for you listening, whether you are prepping for a brutal final exam or catching up before a meeting or just trying to survive the rigors of legal issue spotting, this deep dive is designed as a rigorous, actionable tool to help you master these exact distinctions and build a structured legal analysis. So let's start right at the foundation. What legally transforms a simple theft into the much more severe crime of robbery?
Well, the underlying philosophy is simple. Robbery carries a much heavier penalty because it involves a terrifying danger to the person, not just a danger to property. Society punishes the decision to use violence or fear to overcome someone's will. Legally, robbery is essentially aggravated larceny.
Right, so it builds on the theft.
Exactly. The black-letter law states it consists of the 6 base elements of larceny. First, a trespassory, second, taking, and third, carrying away. Of the fourth, personal property, fifth, of another, sixth, with the intent to steal it.
Okay, so that's the base theft right there.
Right. Plus 2 additional aggravating elements. Seventh, the property is taken from the person or presence of the other. And eighth, the taking is accomplished by force or putting in fear. And hovering over all of this is a foundational, non-negotiable criminal law principle. The defendant's conduct and their state of mind must completely concur in time.
That timing aspect is fascinating. So we know the violence has to happen during the theft. But what if the timing is just a few seconds off? There's a fascinating case from our reading that tests exactly how strict this timeline is. Let's analyze Mason v. Commonwealth. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
So the facts here are basically a perfect storm of bad timing. The defendant broke into a store, took the victim's television set into his arms, and was actively in the process of handing it over to an accomplice who was standing outside.
Right in the middle of the act.
Exactly. Right at that moment, the owner appeared and struck the defendant with a board. Reacting to being hit, the defendant then threw a radio at the owner and fired a gun at him.
And what was the core legal issue?
Did the defendant's use of violence coincide with the taking and asportation of the property to legally constitute robbery?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
The court applied the traditional rule of concurrence for robbery. The rule has 3 elements. First, a larcenous taking and asportation. Second, the use of violence or intimidation. And third, a temporal concurrence where the violence or intimidation occurs before or at the time of the taking.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, the larcenous taking and asportation?
Well, the sub-issue here is whether the TV was actually legally taken and carried away. The sub-rule for larceny requires securing manual dominion over the item and achieving at least a slight movement.
There's a little bit of movement, right?
Yeah, exactly. The court applied the facts, finding this was fully met the exact moment the defendant held the TV in his arms and handed it toward his confederates. He had control, and he moved it. So this element was met.
Understood. Now, what about the second element, the use of violence or intimidation?
For the second element, the sub-rule requires the application of physical force or the installation of fear. The court looked at the facts and found this element was easily met. I mean, the defendant violently threw a radio and fired a deadly weapon at the property owner. That is unquestionable violence.
And the third element, the temporal concurrence.
This is where it all hinges. The sub-rule requires the force to actually facilitate the taking. The court analyzed the strict timeline of events. The taking and the carrying away of the television, that asportation we just defined, were already fully completed before the owner ever struck the defendant and before the defendant returned fire.
Oh, wow. So the theft was already over.
Exactly. Because the theft was completely finished when the violence occurred, the violence wasn't used to get the TV. It was used to escape or retaliate. Therefore, this temporal concurrence element was not met.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The court's holding reversed the conviction for robbery, concluding that the taking and asportation elements did not coincide in time with the violence element.
Okay, to cement that rule in our minds, let's look at a pretty visceral, gross hypothetical based on these strict boundaries. Imagine a sneaky thief stealing a prized, albeit completely disgusting, jar of a victim's surgically removed gallstones.
Oh, that is gross.
Right, so the thief slips the jar into his pocket completely unnoticed. 10 minutes later, down the street, the victim realizes the jar is missing, chases the thief down, and tackles him. The thief then punches the victor in the face just to escape. Under this traditional rule we just saw in Mason, what is the actual legal reality of that street fight? Is it robbery?
Under the strict traditional rule, this is larceny plus a separate battery, but it is unequivocally not robbery. The reason society cares about this exact timeline is because robbery targets the use of violence to overcome someone's will to keep their property.
Because he already had the jar.
Exactly. If you didn't need violence to get the jar of gallstones, you didn't commit robbery. You just committed a theft and then got into a fistfight 10 minutes later. The force simply did not concur with the taking. Now, from a policy standpoint, some modern jurisdictions fix this loophole using a flight or continuing offense theory, which you see in the Model Penal Code.
Right, where the escape counts.
Yes, they argue that a thief willing to use force to escape with the property would have used force to steal it in the first place. But under the traditional common law rule you will face on most exams, that broken timeline defeats the robbery charge.
Okay, let's push on the strictness of the seventh element of robbery you mentioned earlier, taking from the person or presence. I get that if I hold a gun to your head and take your wallet, that's your person. But what happens if the victim is totally incapacitated or worse, completely dead?
Well, the general rule for presence is based on proximity and control. The property taken must be close enough to the victim that, had they not been subjected to the violence, they could have actively prevented the taking. But applying that logic to a deceased victim really stretches the boundaries of the legal definition of a person.
This brings us to a really dark, fascinating scenario. Let's analyze Carey v. United States. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
During a vicious argument, the defendant stabbed the victim, inflicting a fatal blow, an act that actually constituted manslaughter. Then, erroneously believing the victim was merely unconscious, the defendant took money from the pocket of the dress the victim was wearing. In reality, the victim was actually already dead when the money was taken.
And what was the core legal issue?
Can a deceased homicide victim still be legally considered a person within the meaning of the robbery statute?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
The court applied the rule for taking from a person in the context of a lethal attack. The rule has 3 elements. First, the property is taken from the victim's body or clothing. Second, the victim is a human being. And third, the time interval between the fatal blow and the taking is short.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, taking from the victim's body or clothing?
The sub-issue here is physical attachment to the person. The court applied the facts, noting the money was physically removed directly from the pocket of the dress the victim was actively wearing at the time, which fully satisfied the physical attachment requirement.
Understood. Now, what about the second element, the victim being a human being? I mean, this is where the defense essentially argued, Your Honor, my client didn't rob a person, he robbed a piece of meat.
Right. That is exactly what they argued. The defense heavily insisted that a corpse is an inanimate object, not a person capable of being robbed or put in fear. However, the court completely rejected that absurdity. They established the sub-rule that a homicide victim legally retains their status as a person for robbery purposes if the defendant's acts are fundamentally connected. Thus, this element was met.
And the third element, the time interval.
Right, so the sub-issue here is the continuity of the transaction. The court analyzed the strict sequence of events. Because the fatal stabbing and the subsequent theft from the dress happened in immediate, continuous succession, the remarkably short time interval legally bound the violence and the taking together into one single episode. This continuous transaction satisfied the element.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The court affirmed the robbery conviction, concluding that a dead body can legally be a person for the purposes of robbery if the interval between the lethal force and the theft is short.
So let's push back on that interval requirement with another hypothetical. What if a thief poisons someone's coffee, watches them die, and then patiently waits 3 full weeks for the body to decompose in the woods just enough to simply slip a tight biometric ring off their swollen finger?
In that morbid scenario, applying the rule from Carey, the interval was simply far too long. The concurrence and continuous transaction elements completely fail. The defendant would certainly be guilty of murder and likely theft and abuse of a corpse, but it is unequivocally not robbery. The violence and the theft have been completely severed by time.
Now, I want to pivot away from the physical acts and focus on the mental state. You mentioned the intent to steal, the animus furandi. What happens if the robber genuinely, honestly believes the property legally belongs to them, but they use violence to get it back?
This brings us to a major intersection of historical common law and modern public policy. Historically, an honest but mistaken claim of right entirely negated the intent to steal.
Because they think it's theirs.
Exactly. Think about it. If you honestly don't intend to steal because you think the item is already yours, you can't commit larceny, and therefore you can't commit robbery. However, modern courts aggressively push back against this historical defense. Why? Because society deeply wants to discourage violent self-help. We don't want people brawling in the streets over disputed property.
That makes perfect sense. You want people using the courts, not their fists. Let's analyze People v. Tufunga. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
The defendant physically brought $200 of his own cash to give to his ex-wife, specifically so she could pay her bills. But upon concluding she was actually going to give that money to her mother instead, he became enraged and used physical force to forcefully take back the exact same $200 he had just handed over.
And what was the core legal issue?
Does the claim of right defense apply to the forcible retaking of specific chattel, thereby negating the intent to steal required for robbery?
What rule of law did the court apply? Please state the full black-letter rule and break it down into its testable elements.
The court applied the modern claim of right defense to robbery. The rule has 3 elements. First, an honest belief in ownership or right to possess. Second, the property must be a specific identifiable chattel. And third, the taking must not be to satisfy a general, unliquidated debt.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. How did the court apply the first element, an honest belief in ownership?
The sub-issue is the subjective mental state of the defendant. The court didn't care if he was legally right. They cared if he believed he was right. Because the defendant himself had just brought the money and placed strict conditions on its use, the facts strongly supported that he genuinely, subjectively believed he had the lawful right to revoke that conditional gift. This element was met.
Understood. And just to clarify our terms here, chattel just means a tangible, movable piece of property, right? Like a specific car, specific watch, or a specific bill. Now, what about the second element, the property being a specific identifiable chattel?
Spot on. The court looked at exactly what was physically taken. The defendant did not just take any random $200 from her purse to satisfy a grudge. He took the exact same physical currency he had just handed over to her moments prior. It was a specific, traceable piece of property. The element was met.
And the third element, the restriction against collecting a general debt. What's an unliquidated debt?
An unliquidated debt is a general claim for money where the exact amount hasn't been finally determined or isn't tied to specific physical cash. The court used this case to explicitly overrule past precedent that had allowed violent self-help for general debts.
Oh, so they changed the rule here.
Yes. The sub-rule now strictly forbids using force to collect an unliquidated debt or back wages, because again, that leads to anarchy. But because this wasn't a general debt collection, it was the immediate retrieval of a specific physical piece of property, it bypassed that new public policy restriction. The element was satisfied.
And after analyzing all the elements, what was the court's final conclusion?
The court concluded that a claim of right jury instruction absolutely should have been given to the jury because the forcible taking was of a specific chattel, which under these very narrow circumstances can legally negate the required intent to steal. He might be guilty of battery, but not robbery.
So we've seen how robbery relies heavily on this incredibly tight concurrence of immediate force and immediate presence. But what if the threat isn't immediate? Say the threat is to break someone's legs next week, or to publish their darkest secrets online tomorrow. Does the law just let them walk because the timing is off?
Absolutely not. But that exact scenario highlights what was historically a massive loophole in common law robbery. Because of the requirement for immediate bodily injury and physical presence, those delayed threats couldn't be prosecuted as robbery.
So they just fell through the cracks.
Basically, the reasoning was that if someone says, "I'll hurt you tomorrow," you have time to go to the police. To plug that exact gap, legislatures created statutory extortion, which the general public commonly calls blackmail.
How does the application of extortion bridge that gap functionally? It sounds like it covers a much wider range of bad behavior.
It does. While robbery requires immediate bodily harm and the presence of the victim, extortion covers the corrupt acquisition of property through threats of future harm. That includes threats to inflict future bodily injury, future property damage, or, crucially, the exposure of disgraces and secrets that would subject the victim to public ridicule.
Oh, so ruining someone's reputation.
Exactly. And legally, the structure is fascinating. In some jurisdictions, extortion actually requires the physical acquisition of the property to be completed. In others, merely making the threat with the intent to acquire the property is enough to trigger the charge.
Are there any defenses if the terrible secret the extortionist is threatening to expose is actually 100% true? Like, what if they aren't lying?
This is a vital distinction for exams, and it trips up a lot of people. In extortion, truth is absolutely no defense. If you threaten to expose a corporate embezzler to the police unless they pay you off, that is still extortion, even if the victim actually is an embezzler. You cannot legally use the threat of exposure or a threat to induce a labor strike or boycott as leverage to acquire property. The crime is the corrupt leverage, not the falsehood.
That makes total sense. You're weaponizing the truth for profit. That brings us to the end of the module's substantive doctrine.
Indeed. And now, to synthesize all of the rules we've covered into a structured framework. When you are sitting in your exam and you see a property crime escalate in a fact pattern, here is your step-by-step diagnostic checklist. You need to apply this rigidly. Step 1. Verify the 6 base elements of larceny, which is a trespassery taking and carrying away of the personal property of another with the intent to steal. If that intent to steal is missing, for example, you spot a valid claim of right for a specific chattel like we saw in Tufunga, the analysis stops right there. It cannot be robbery.
Right. If there's no theft, there's no robbery. Got it.
Exactly. Step 2. Check the person or presence requirement. Apply the proximity and control test. And remember, Carrie, even a dead body counts if the time interval between the lethal blow and the taking is remarkably short. Step 3. Check the violence or intimidation requirement. Is the threat of immediate bodily injury?
Okay, so immediacy is key there.
Yes. Step 4. Run the concurrence test. Did the violence happen before or during the taking and asportation? If the force happened after the taking was already complete, under traditional common law rules like we analyzed in Mason, it is not robbery. Finally, step 5. If the threat is of future harm, future damage to reputation, or exposing a secret, immediately pivot your exam analysis away from robbery and dive straight into statutory extortion.
So if you're staring at a fact pattern on your final, your first reflex should be to just run that exact checklist. It really brings us back to that clean accountant's ledger we started with, or rather, it gives you the tools to organize how incredibly messy that ledger actually gets in practice. And it leaves you with a lingering, provocative thought based on this reading. If the law relies so heavily on a fraction of a second in timing, or a subtle, subjective state of mind to turn a messy physical street brawl into a high-level felony like robbery, are our courts actually punishing the physical violence itself, or are they punishing the sheer audacity of the thief's imagination in that exact moment? Something for you to mull over before your next exam.